For decades, Frank Mallerie, an old veteran known as the Desert Ghost, has been relentlessly digging in the desolate New Mexico desert. He carries an immense, unspoken promise to find his brother in arms, Reggie Campbell. Reggie, part of the secret Lancer 7 unit, was tragically left behind in 1971 during a brutal ambush in Laos, declared unrecoverable by the military. After 50 years of tireless, solitary searching, guided by old maps and sheer will, Frank finally unearths a sun-bleached fragment of cloth and a rusted metal insignia bearing the name Campbell. But as Frank holds this long-sought proof, an F-16 fighter jet roars overhead, circling. What does this unexpected aerial presence mean for Frank's decades-long quest? If Frank's incredible story of loyalty and unwavering promise moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true stories of unsung heroes. Share this with someone who believes some promises are worth keeping, no matter the cost. Thank you for listening. The desert lay still, too still for August. The cracked, sun-bleached ground shimmered beneath the merciless noon sun as an old man worked alone, his weathered hands unsteady yet unwavering. There were no tourists here, no curious lenses, no sound but the whisper of dry wind. Just heat, stillness, and one man with a shovel. Locals called him a madman, a relic of war chasing specters no one else could see. A veteran long past his war, lost somewhere between memory and sand. That morning, as his shovel paused midair, he leaned forward and whispered into the dust, his voice low and rough. "I'll find it, Reggie. I owe you that. I owe you at least a damn candle in the dirt." Then it came, an unexpected roar overhead, a thunderous cry from the sky, sharp and commanding. An F-16 fighter jet streaked above, circling once before disappearing as fast as it came. And for the first time in decades, someone looked down and noticed. His name was Frank Mallerie. Not that many around these parts remembered, or if they did, the name hadn't passed their lips in years. In Sage Hollow, a fading town clinging to the last threads of relevance, people who still remembered him didn't use his name anymore. They called him the Desert Ghost, a wandering figure they glimpsed now and then, moving at the town's edge. He came in like clockwork, bought canned chili and black coffee from the general store, nodded a silent thanks to Nancy behind the counter, and vanished once more into the sun-hammered wilderness. He lived in solitude, tucked away in a sun-scoured 1972 Winnebago that hadn't rumbled to life in well over a decade. It sat crooked in a forgotten corner of New Mexico's high desert, half buried near the rusted perimeter fence of a long-abandoned military testing ground. The Winnebago's tires had sunk halfway into the sand, and a frayed American flag drooped limply above the cracked windshield. It barely moved in the wind, much like Frank himself. Frank was 78 now. Once broad-shouldered and upright, the years had bent him slowly, a vertebra at a time, until he stooped under the weight of time. His skin had turned to leather under decades of sun. His beard had grown into a wild, snow-white thicket, and his eyes, those eyes, never flinched, never darted around like most men's. When he looked at you, he looked calm, direct, and heavy. Not with fear, not with anger, just a still and haunting burden. Long ago, Frank had worn the Green Beret. He served with a special forces unit so covert, it didn't officially exist. Lancer 7, they called it. They were ghosts before he ever became one. Inserted into Laos in a war the government swore never happened, they were trained to map, watch, destroy, and leave no trace. No evidence, no survivors, no medals. And Frank never spoke of what they did, not to friends, not to strangers, but if anyone ever earned the right to ask if someone had truly understood, maybe then he would have told them about Reggie Campbell. Reggie wasn't just another soldier. He was more. Family, a brother by fire and blood. A good-hearted boy from Alabama, always quick with a laugh that cut through jungle noise like music. He carried a harmonica everywhere, snug in his shirt pocket, and could charm snakes or generals depending on the day. Reggie was younger than Frank by 3 years, but smarter, sharper, keener than half the brass they'd served under. In the field, he moved like a ghost, silent, focused, fearless. Even when hell rained down, Reggie didn't break. But the jungle didn't care. On their final mission together, something went sideways. The extraction bird, just a shadow above the canopy, took a direct hit from enemy fire. Smoke billowed, rotors buckled. Chaos. Reggie had pushed Frank forward, made damn sure he was the first one aboard. Frank still remembered that choking smoke, the screaming blades trying to lift. He saw Reggie charging toward them, sprinting through mud and gunfire, until a spray of shrapnel took him down just before he reached the chopper. Then came the command, cold, final, leave him. No recovery, no rescue, just go. Frank hadn't shouted, hadn't cursed. He followed orders just like he'd been trained to do, but something inside him broke that day. A silent, unseen fracture, one that never truly mended. When the war ended, Frank vanished from view. He tried for a while to piece together something like a life. El Paso, a job at a hardware store, a short-lived marriage that left little more than an empty ring box and a few pictures in a drawer. A few goats, even, at one point. But it never stuck. The world felt too far away. Eventually, he drove west until the road turned to dust, and when it ended, so did his wandering. He parked the Winnebago and never left. Every morning, just before the sun cracked the horizon, Frank would lace up his old jungle boots, same pair he'd worn in '72, grab his spade, and step into the desert's embrace. At that hour, the heat hadn't yet risen to burn, and the silence felt almost sacred. Clean. He never wandered far, maybe 50 yards from the RV. He'd kneel down, open a weathered leather pouch, and unfold hand-drawn maps he'd spent years sketching, adjusting, revising. Grids, coordinates, ghost trails. Then he would dig. Some days he'd dig 2 feet deep, others 6. On windy days, when sand lashed his eyes and cracked his lips, he sometimes had to stop. But he always returned. No one knew what he was looking for. The townspeople had theories. Buried treasure, secret CIA caches. One YouTube conspiracy kid swore it was aliens. Most just wrote him off as another old warhound still chasing a battle that ended half a century ago. But Frank knew, and so did the desert. Every so often, he unearthed things no one could explain. Bits of canvas scattered like confetti in the wind. A rusted belt hook buried in dry soil. A twisted fragment of metal, stamped long ago with numbers barely visible through the corrosion. Each time he found something, no matter how small or worn, Frank would kneel, press his fingertips into the dirt, and whisper under his breath, voice low and steady, "I'll find you, Reggie. I swore I would." He wasn't the kind to linger in town. When Frank passed through Sage Hollow, he spoke only when necessary, buying supplies, nodding once or twice, then heading out again with the same quiet resolve. Some folks eyed him curiously, others kept their distance, unsure of what lay behind that weather-worn face. But the older ones, those who had felt the sting of waiting for someone who never came home, understood. They saw the weight he carried and respected the silence around it. Frank didn't want applause. He didn't need anyone's gratitude, and he sure as hell wasn't after sympathy. All he ever wanted was to keep a promise, one made a long time ago, in a place the world had long since forgotten. Each morning he'd plant a single candle in the earth, just before setting off with his shovel slung over his shoulder. To anyone else, it was nothing. But to Frank, that flickering flame was a banner, an invisible flag carried into battle, a symbol of a vow no one else had heard, but one he could never break. Time had moved on, the headlines changed. The world turned its back on the jungles and the dead. But Frank never did. Back in 1971, before the desert sun and silence carved lines into his face, Frank Mallerie had been something else entirely. He wasn't yet the ghost wandering the high plains. He was a soldier, sharp-eyed, lean with muscle, and confident in the way only young men on the edge of war can be. He served with Lancer 7, a unit that officially didn't exist. No insignias, no records. Their orders were whispered, and their missions never written down. They were special forces operating in Laos, just across the Vietnamese border, though the U.S. government denied it then, and probably still would. What they did was off the books, outside the law, and absolutely not allowed to fail. On paper, their objectives were simple: parachute in, watch enemy movements, sabotage supply routes, and guide in airstrikes. But nothing about the land or the war was simple. They worked in shadows, in teams of 5 or 6 at most, with no reinforcements and little hope of rescue. When things went fine, they went bad fast. Days passed with no contact. Radios sat silent. Jungle crept in from all sides. And through it all, Frank had one constant: Reggie Campbell. Reggie was the kind of man you prayed to have beside you when the night got too long or the odds too cruel. Born in Dothan, Alabama, Reggie had that deep Southern grit, tempered by a quiet strength. He never talked himself up, never bragged, but in a fight, he moved like a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect. He was fast, smart, fearless, and if a man went down, Reggie was already hauling him out, no hesitation, no questions asked. They were brothers, maybe not by blood, but by everything else that mattered. They shared trenches, shelters, and scars. Together, they held a foxhole in Khe Sanh, later a humid jungle nest near Bain Phanup. They'd bled beside each other, stitched wounds with shaky hands, and once sat back to back for 6 hours while a North Vietnamese patrol crept past them. So close they could hear whispers in the dark. They didn't need words. One glance said enough. They were a team. But every war has its line, the one you cross and never come back from. For Frank and Reggie, that line was drawn in March of '71 during a mission no one dared speak of afterward. The objective had looked routine at first glance. Lancer 7 was ordered to sweep a narrow valley just outside of Chepoi near a suspected weapons depot. The intel was confident, little to no resistance, in and out fast. They jumped in under cover of darkness, landing silent among the trees. But by noon, they were boxed in, engaged in a firefight they never saw coming. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a setup. Someone had tipped off the NVA. The ambush was clean, brutal, and exact. What stayed with Frank wasn't the gunfire or the explosions. It was the unnatural sound of trees splintering under relentless machine gun fire. The radio hissed static as they screamed for extraction, hoping someone was listening. When the evac chopper finally punched through the canopy, its blades shredded the humid air, struggling to find an open space to land. They sprinted for the clearing. Frank and Reggie took up the rear, covering the others as bullets shredded leaves and bark all around them. One teammate dropped, then another. Frank and Reggie dragged them both, hearts pounding, legs burning, adrenaline turning pain into momentum. Frank clambered up first, grabbing the chopper skids, lungs raw, rifle banging against his chest. He turned, reaching down, eyes locking on Reggie, who was only a few yards behind. And then it hit. A burst of light, a searing boom. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the tail of the chopper. The entire frame bucked sideways, blades shrieking. Retired couple up in Durango. It wheezed on the hills and had rust in the seams, but it ran, and that was enough. Frank packed light, an old duffel, his father's hunting knife, a med kit, and the map. He didn't tell anyone he was going. There wasn't anyone left to tell. The engine coughed to life with a metallic groan, and he pulled onto the highway without looking back. The road stretched wide and empty, uncoiling like a ribbon across the land. Sometimes there were signs, but mostly there weren't. He passed through forgotten towns, motels with half-lit vacancy signs, diners playing songs nobody remembered. And the whole while he thought about Reggie, not in speeches or eulogies, but in flashes. The way he laughed, the way he always carried the radio, the way he'd nudge Frank in the ribs when things got tense, like, "We've got this, brother." At night, Frank parked at the edge of whatever patch of gravel passed for a campground. He cooked over sterno and stared at the stars until the cold crept into his joints. He didn't sleep much. He didn't need to. Every day he got a little closer, and every day he felt it. The pull, like gravity, but heavier. Southern New Mexico hit him like a punch to the chest. The sky opened up wider there, the earth cracked and dry. But it wasn't dead. The place breathed. Not like something living, but something remembering. And when Frank finally rearmed the basin, those same curves in the hills, that same low hum in the air, he knew he was close. The Winnebago rumbled to a stop at the edge of a barbed wire fence, long since rusted and slack. There were signs once, warnings maybe, but the sun had bleached them bare. Frank climbed out, his boots crunching the gravel, his shadow stretching long in the evening light. He stood there staring at that land. This was the place, he knew it. The same way you know when someone's looking at you, even if you can't see them. Something in his bones told him. It had taken him 30 years to get here, 30 years of drifting through other people's towns, wearing silence like a second skin. 30 years of carrying a voice that wasn't his own, echoing in his ears. I'll find you, Reggie. I swear to God I will. And now here he was. Frank stepped through the fence, into the dust, into the place where memory and promise blurred. His legs ached with every step. His heart thudded slow but steady. He didn't have a plan beyond this. Never needed one. He'd made a vow. And sometimes the only thing a man has left is the vow he couldn't break. This wasn't closure. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't about peace. It was about Reggie. It was about not letting the world erase someone just because a file said unrecoverable. It was about keeping faith when no one else did. Because Frank Mallerie didn't come here to bury a ghost. He came to bring his brother home. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. Just filled the RV at a rundown mechanic shop near Las Cruces. Loaded it up with canned goods, fuel canisters, and a pile of old military tools. Then pointed the front bumper south and hit the road. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then gravel to bare desert sand. When the RV could go no further, he parked it beneath the raw blue sky, stepped out, and began to dig. He didn't have a map, no master plan, no one guiding his hand. Just a shovel, a compass hanging from a worn cord around his neck, and a promise that wouldn't let him stop. Each morning, Frank Mallerie left the shelter of the Winnebago and walked out 50, 60 yards into the desert, his boots breaking the silence of the sand. To most, this place would have looked lifeless, like the earth had exhaled its last breath centuries ago. But to Frank, it was alive with purpose. He saw not a barren wasteland, but an open canvas filled with possibility. He imagined the ground marked in invisible grids, squares only he could see, and he dug inside one until the soil hardened or the wind began to howl, pushing sand into his eyes and throat. Then he'd shift over 10 feet, move his little red flags, and begin again. Nobody told him to do this. Nobody asked him to. No one helped either. And he didn't need them to. Frank wasn't digging for hope. He was digging because he'd made a vow. To the few townsfolk who occasionally spotted him lingering on the outskirts, he was more myth than man, an oddball, a ghost in denim. Some whispered that he was former military, driven mad by war or grief or sunstroke. Others guessed he was out there hunting treasure, one of those old-timers who got seduced by stories of lost gold or buried Spanish riches. Some said he was building a secret bunker for when the world ended. But none of them ever really asked. Not truly. And Frank didn't care. Because every time his shovel pierced the crust of red desert earth, he could still hear Reggie's voice, clear and steady in his mind, saying, "You better not give up on me, brother." And each time Frank answered back, out loud and without shame, "I'm still here." Through searing summers and winters that could crack your bones, Frank stayed. He patched the leaks in the RV's roof with tar and duct tape, fixed the radiator twice with nothing but grit and scavenged parts. One summer, he dropped 20 pounds when the heat nearly claimed him. Another time, a coyote broke into his stores, tore through his food. He chased it off swinging a rusted crowbar, shouting every curse he knew until it fled. Then, standing under the stars, he laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. He was alone, yes, but not forsaken, because somewhere beneath that endless sand was the man he had sworn never to leave behind. Most folks spend their final years settling down, softening at the edges. But Frank Mallerie, he spent his digging towards something, toward a face, a memory, a moment frozen in time, toward the day when someone else, maybe a soldier, maybe a stranger, would stand over one of those holes and say, "There you are." And when that moment came, Frank would be ready. In Sage Hollow, a town that barely cleared 600 people on a good week, his name was unknown, but his presence was felt. Once a month, like clockwork, he'd roll into town, quiet as a shadow, load up on supplies, never linger, never talk. The locals knew him only as the strange old man who came and went, who smelled faintly of rust and gasoline. None of them guessed that just 30 miles away, in the middle of a brutal, sun-beaten desert, Frank Mallerie was not chasing riches or legends, but something far more sacred. Still, in small towns, rumors bloomed like weeds. The teenagers were especially cruel. One group followed him out one day, laughing behind their phones as they filmed him digging. The video, titled "Desert Grandpa Digs for Aliens," went halfway viral. It got laughs from people who would never understand the weight behind the silence. In the clip, Frank never looked up, never paused, just kept working, shovel after shovel, as if the whole world depended on that next dig. Some said he had ancient maps, secret coordinates, a lead on Spanish gold. Others whispered about hidden tunnels, military secrets, even UFOs. It gave the regulars at the diner something to talk about between pie and coffee, but no one ever came close to the truth. Not really, because the truth was this: every hole he dug was a silent prayer. Every bead of sweat that dripped into the soil was an offering. Each swing of the shovel was a conversation with a brother who wasn't there. Frank Mallerie wasn't chasing ghosts. He was trying to bring one home. Still, not all hearts in Sage Hollow were blind to the deeper current beneath his silence. Nancy, who ran the general store, always slipped an extra bottle of water into his bag. Never charged him. Just a small act of kindness she never spoke of. Harold, the old mechanic who mostly kept to himself these days, would occasionally leave a box of canned chili by the fence near where Frank sometimes parked the RV. He never knocked, never waited for thanks. Nobody offered pity. They offered dignity. Small, quiet acts for a man they didn't understand, but somehow knew deserved them. The respect had always lingered, quiet, unspoken, but real. Even in a town hardened by skepticism, there were still those who could recognize what true duty looked like, even if it came cloaked in decades of silence and the grip of a shovel, rather than a salute. The desert wind had just died down after sunrise, leaving behind a hush so complete it made Frank Mallerie's ears ring with echoes from another life. The air remained dry, the heat not yet awake, and the light slanting across the sand was soft, almost forgiving. It was the desert's one small kindness, a momentary gentleness before noon arrived with its merciless blaze. Frank stepped out of his RV, moving like he had each day before, boots laced tight, his worn shovel in hand, a compass bouncing lightly against his chest. Age had slowed his pace, his joints protested, stiffer than ever, and the desert air carved into him more sharply now. But the fire that had once driven a young soldier still burned undimmed inside him. This morning he chose a new grid, 10 feet east of the area he'd been digging for the past week. The soil there gave a little more under his boots, softer, less resistant. He recognized the signs immediately. This was impact ground, the kind shaped by sudden violence and then buried under decades of heat, pressure, and time. He'd learned how to read it, how to feel for memory and dirt. With steady hands and the focus of a man long trained in patience, he began cutting into the earth. Layer by layer, inch by inch, he sifted through dust with a meticulous rhythm. His eyes never wandered. They searched each handful like something sacred might be hiding inside. Then came a sound, not loud, not sharp, just a faint, unfamiliar crunch. He froze. Dropping to his knees, he brushed the loose dirt away with his bare fingers, gently, reverently, like a man touching the threshold of something holy. What emerged from beneath the soil was a sun-bleached, ragged scrap of fabric, faded nearly to white, but unmistakably military. Beneath it, half swallowed by the earth and streaked with rust, was a piece of metal. An insignia, bent and discolored, but still whole. Frank leaned in closer, his breath caught in his chest. Through the rust, faint but still visible, was the name etched into the tag: Campbell. Frank didn't move. The world around him seemed to fall away. The desert folded inward, and suddenly he wasn't in Sage Hollow anymore. He was back in that jungle, back in the smoke and screams and chaos, back in the moment where Reggie had vanished and never returned. He cradled the tag in both hands, his fingers trembling now. For a long time, he didn't say a word, and then quietly his lips parted. "I told you I'd find you," he whispered. His voice was cracked, raw. "I never stopped looking." The tears came slowly, not the desperate sobs of a man broken by grief, but the silent kind that carried the weight of decades. He didn't fall apart. He just sat there beside his shovel, shoulders quaking slightly as the tears cut down through the dust caked on his cheeks. What Frank didn't know, and what nobody in Sage Hollow had reason to suspect, was that for nearly half a year, a low-priority Pentagon surveillance program had been monitoring thermal and motion data over old military training zones. Frank's persistent digging had triggered a handful of anomalies. They flagged on him, but nothing came of it. Just a civilian, old, harmless, probably chasing ghosts. But that morning the signal changed. A junior analyst at White Sands noticed it. A sudden thermal pause in a familiar grid, followed by a small but erratic burst of movement. The kind that shows up when someone stumbles on something they didn't expect. A phone call followed. Quiet, unofficial. And 20 minutes later, the sky above the desert let out a roar. Frank squinted into the sun. A streak of gray cut across the pale blue, banking hard and coming around slow. It circled low, deliberate, not a training exercise, not a random pass. This jet was watching him. Frank stood instinctively, his spine straightening as though he still wore the uniform. He raised a hand against the glare and stared up at the F-16 making another slow arc overhead. It didn't pass on. It didn't buzz by. It circled, as if marking something, as if bearing witness. Inside the cockpit, the pilot had received almost nothing in the way of detail. Verify human presence in Sector 27B. Visual confirmation only. No engagement. But what the pilot saw gave him pause. A lone, elderly man standing unmoving in the middle of an empty desert, cradling what looked like dog tags close to his chest. He didn't radio it in. He didn't break protocol. He just kept circling. Back at the Pentagon, satellite imaging confirmed it. A crash site, likely undocumented, probably scrubbed from the records decades ago, seemed to have reappeared at last. The recovery order came quickly and quietly. A forensic team was mobilized. Under the guise of a routine Air Force survey, the mission began. No media coverage, no public recognition, just a quiet command. Go there, retrieve what he had discovered, and bring back the truth. Out in the barren desert, Frank stood unmoving, eyes locked on the last light draining from the sky. He slipped the dog tag back into the pocket of his worn shirt and slowly exhaled. He didn't know if anyone was really coming. He didn't know if the military was going to bury him, all over again, the way they had buried Reggie. But he felt something, a shift in the air. The long, deafening silence had cracked. Somewhere in the hidden chambers of the same system that had once abandoned them, someone was finally paying attention. The morning after the jet's shadow passed overhead, the desert stirred with noise. It began as a low vibration, deep and rhythmic, unmistakable. Frank had heard that sound before, lifetimes ago, in a dense jungle across the ocean. But this wasn't a memory resurfacing. This was real. From the eastern sky, a Black Hawk helicopter emerged, slicing slowly through the air above the hills. Sand lifted in thick spirals as the rotors beat down on the earth, descending toward the barren flat near Frank's sun-baked RV. Its presence churned up more than desert dust. 50 years of silence, 50 years of waiting, 50 years of grief too heavy to speak. Frank didn't flinch. He stood upright, motionless, spine aligned, boots locked in place, as if he'd been frozen in time since 1971. His dog tags hung over his chest like they had always been there, untouched. As the aircraft settled and its doors yawned open, a unit of soldiers emerged, each dressed in full ceremonial uniform. At the front was a man in his late 50s, chest lined with ribbons, boots hitting the earth like thunder, a lieutenant general. He approached Frank with a slow, deliberate pace. Then, without a word, he lifted his hand in salute. Frank paused for only a moment before returning the gesture. Sharp, steady, silent. Then the general spoke. Sergeant First Class Frank Mallerie, on behalf of the United States Army and the nation you serve with unwavering honor, we thank you, and we're sorry it took us this long. Frank didn't respond. He gave a small nod, his face unreadable, and raised a single arm to point toward the nearby patch of disturbed earth. He's here, Frank said plainly. Dig careful. The recovery team worked through the heat of the day, careful and methodical, Ground-penetrating radar scanned the soil while gloved hands brushed away layers of history, inch by inch, as if unearthing sacred ground. Frank stood off to the side, arms folded tight across his chest, sweat tracing lines down the weathered contours of his face as the desert sun bore down. He never looked away. Just before noon, a young corporal rose to his feet, holding something with reverence, as if it were a priceless relic. Dog tags, bent, tarnished, but the letters were still legible. Campbell R. U.S. Army. Oppose. Minutes later, they uncovered splintered fragments of bone, a single worn boot sole, and inside a rusted ammunition pouch, a harmonica, remarkably intact, yet still silent. Frank turned his back to the scene. He didn't need to witness more. He had already known. He had always known. By the time the sun had slipped below the horizon, the story had already escaped the boundaries of the desert. A local reporter from El Paso had caught wind of the military activity. A photo surfaced. Frank standing beside the general, both solemn. That image spread like wildfire. Local news ran it first, then national. CBS, Fox, CNN. The headline echoed across every screen. Vietnam veteran finds missing brother in arms. After 50 years of searching alone, they called it remarkable. A testament to devotion, perseverance, and a kind of brotherhood that death itself couldn't erode. Messages poured in from senators, from retired commanders, from voices Frank hadn't heard in decades. There were offers for televised interviews, military ceremonies, honorary medals, even an invitation from the Pentagon, another from Capitol Hill. Frank refused them all. He asked for one thing only. He looked the general in the eye and said, "Let him go home." That was it. 1 week later, Reggie Campbell was flown home to Dothan, Alabama. His remains were given full military honors, a 21-gun salute, a carefully folded flag, every rite, every tradition, done by the book. His blood relatives were long gone. Only distant cousins remained. But the entire town came. Veterans from every branch of service lined the winding cemetery path, dressed in formal uniforms. Some stood in silence. Others couldn't hold back tears. At the front, Frank stood alone. No dress blues, no medals. Just worn boots and the same olive drab shirt he'd worn every single day for the past decade. It was scrubbed clean, buttoned up. Over his heart hung Reggie's dog tag. When the last notes of taps echoed across the treetops, Frank closed his eyes. He murmured softly, almost as if speaking to the wind, "You're home now, brother." Far away in New Mexico, the old RV remained where it had always been, baking under the desert sun, still and silent once again. Frank lingered there a few more days before finally packing up. For the first time in decades, he folded his map away. The shovel, his constant companion for so many years, now rested quietly. This wasn't a journey made for glory or recognition. He hadn't gone searching for medals or headlines. He had gone to fulfill a promise. And now that promise had been honored. They tried to give him medals, invited him for interviews, even talked about building statues. Frank declined them all. He wasn't interested in the world knowing his name. What mattered to him was that one name, not his, would not be forgotten. And now that name was finally remembered. That morning at Arlington National Cemetery, the sky was wide and still, an endless sheet of crisp, solemn blue. The kind of sky that demands silence. White headstones rolled on in perfect rows toward the horizon, each a testament to service, to sacrifice. But today, every eye turned toward a flag-draped casket resting beneath the sheltering limbs of a great oak. Reggie Campbell had made it home. The honor guard moved with precise, silent grace, each step deliberate, each breath measured. A young Marine held the folded flag, cradling it as if it were a sacred relic. The crowd stood unmoving, reverent, as the minister spoke of duty, of brotherhood, and of a sacrifice that had waited 5 long decades for this day of acknowledgement. Near the front, apart from the generals and the politicians and the cameras, stood Frank Mallerie. He wore the same olive green dress uniform he had been issued back in 1971. The color had faded, the fabric was thinning at the elbows, but it still fit. Pressed sharp, buttoned all the way up. No medals adorned his chest. Just one small item pinned neatly over his heart, Reggie's dog tag. In his hands, he held the triangle-folded American flag he'd just been given. He held it with a grip so tight his knuckles had gone white, as though he feared it might break apart in his arms. As the minister's voice softened into silence, people began to lift their eyes to the sky. At first, only a faint hum, then a sharp, growing roar. 4 F-16s tore across the horizon, locked in perfect formation, their wings slicing the blue with military precision. And then one jet pulled away, banking sharply to the left, leaving a gap. The missing man formation. The ultimate honor performed high above, one pilot absent from the sky to mark one soul gone from this world. Frank didn't look up. He didn't need to. He whispered just loud enough for himself, maybe for the man beside him to hear. "Took me half a lifetime, buddy. But I kept my word." Then he closed his eyes. No applause, no speeches. That wasn't why he was here. He had never needed the headlines. This moment was all he had ever wanted. One grave, one name, one promise kept. As the mourners slowly dispersed, Frank remained rooted beside the headstone. He didn't shed a tear. He didn't say another word. He simply stood, steady and silent, like a soldier still on duty. He stayed that way until the wind picked up again, and the last jet disappeared beyond the clouds. Some stories never make the news. They don't trend. They don't go viral. They happen quietly, stretching across the decades in places no one visits, dusty roads, forgotten deserts, where a single man with nothing more than a shovel and a vow held fast when the rest of the world moved on. Frank Mallerie never fought for recognition. He didn't care for trophies. What he fought for was memory, for friendship, for loyalty, for a truth that feels more and more rare these days, honor. In a world that moves too fast, where news fades in hours and promises are too easily broken, Frank's story whispers something timeless, that some debts can only be repaid in silence, one step at a time, that some woes are so deep they echo across decades. Maybe we all carry a Reggie in our hearts, someone we lost touch with, someone we still owe, not through war, but in unspoken apologies, overdue phone calls, or quiet promises we didn't realize we'd made. So ask yourself, who would you dig for day after day for 50 years? Maybe it's not about war at all. Maybe it's about love, about honor, about keeping your word even when no one else remembers you gave it.